Hello, everyone, and welcome back to MrDarXnights. I know many of you use these videos to relax or fall asleep. So before you drift off, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable and begin. Imagine waking up in your own bed to find your entire family dead without ever hearing a sound. That's what happened to 9-year-old Hannah Myers. And what makes it even more chilling is what the killer left behind. It was early spring in the quiet town of Ashwood, Oregon, one of those small, tucked-away places that rarely made the news. The kind of town where the roads curled around pine trees, and neighbors knew each other's dogs by name. It wasn't a place known for fear or violence or secrets. People left their doors unlocked. Children played outside until dark. It was safe, or at least it used to be. In March of 2007, everything changed. The Myers family lived in a modest two-story home at the end of Maple Street. John and Melissa Myers were known in the community as kind, hard-working people. John worked at the local lumber mill. Melissa taught third grade at the town's only elementary school. They had 2 children, 16-year-old Josh and 9-year-old Hannah. To the outside world, they were ordinary, quiet, good people. The kind of family you'd wave to from across the street. Nothing about them suggested trouble. There were no financial struggles, no history of police calls, no whispered rumors. Just a peaceful household in a peaceful neighborhood. The night of March 11th was like any other. Neighbors recall seeing the lights go out around 10. No parties, no visitors. Just another quiet night beneath a sky full of stars. But by morning, 3 members of the Myers family were dead. It was Hannah who made the 911 call just before 8 a.m. Her voice, though calm, carried something else beneath it, something the dispatcher later described as hollow. She said she'd woken up and couldn't find her parents. She'd checked her brother's room. She'd seen something that didn't feel real, something wrong, something she didn't understand. When first responders arrived, they found the front door unlocked. The house was still. No signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no forced entry. Everything was eerily undisturbed. John and Melissa were found in their bedroom, lying side by side, their throats carefully slit. The bed sheets were soaked in blood, but there was no evidence of a fight. No sign either had moved. Their eyes were closed. Peaceful, almost. Josh was found in his own bed upstairs, killed in the same way, same method, same silence. Only Hannah was left unharmed. She was found sitting on the living room floor, clutching a small pillow, her bare feet tucked under her. There were no marks on her, no injuries, no signs of sedation or trauma. She simply said, again and again, that she had slept through the night, that she didn't hear anything, that when she woke up, the house was just quiet. The police were stunned, not just by the brutality of the crime, but by the impossibility of it. 3 people murdered in their sleep, silently. No neighbors heard anything. The dog, a 3-year-old Labrador named Benny, known for barking at even the sound of passing cars, hadn't made a sound. He was found unharmed in the laundry room, tail wagging. Inside the house, nothing appeared to be stolen. Valuables were left untouched. There were no fingerprints, no foreign DNA. The murder weapon was never found. There were no footprints, no signs of entry or exit, no muddy tracks, no open windows. And then there was the note. It was found on Hannah's nightstand, written in neat, almost clinical handwriting. 5 words, centered on a torn piece of lined paper. She is the chosen one. No signature, no context, just those words, as if they explained everything. As if they meant something that only the writer and the reader could possibly understand. Detectives couldn't make sense of it. The crime scene didn't match anything in their experience. The surgical nature of the wounds, the precision, the lack of noise or panic, it all felt off, almost professional. But there was no reason, no motive, no enemies, no debts, no evidence. Hannah, when questioned, remained quiet. Not evasive, not resistant, just quiet. She answered the basic questions: her bedtime, what she ate, what pajamas she wore, but when pressed for anything else, she simply said she remembered nothing, that she fell asleep listening to the rain, that she woke up when the sun came in through her curtains. That was it. For weeks, the town reeled. Ashwood wasn't the kind of place that attracted crime scene vans and news helicopters. But now, it was a center of national attention. Reporters camped outside the house. Speculation swirled. Some whispered that it was a home invasion gone wrong. Others believed in something darker, a targeted killing, a cult, a secret. Some even began to fear Hannah herself, though no evidence ever pointed to her. Theories filled the void where facts were missing. But through it all, one truth remained. Someone had walked into a family's home in the dead of night, murdered 3 people without a sound, and left without a trace, sparing only a 9-year-old girl, and leaving behind a cryptic message that would haunt investigators for years. In Ashwood, the silence that once meant peace now meant fear. And the mystery was only beginning. The morning sunlight crept slowly through the curtains of the small house on Maple Street. The sky outside was pale and clouded, still damp from the overnight rain. Inside the Myers home, the stillness lingered. It was the kind of quiet that didn't feel normal, not peaceful, just off. Hannah Myers woke up around 7:45 a.m. by her own account. She wasn't startled awake. She didn't hear a noise or feel afraid. She simply opened her eyes, the same way she always did. She lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, not yet realizing what had happened. The house felt strange, too still, too heavy. At 9 years old, Hannah had grown used to the comforting sounds of her family's morning routine. Her mother humming in the kitchen, her father's deep voice on the phone with the mill, her brother's footsteps thumping down the stairs, always in a rush. But that morning there was none of that. She thought maybe she'd overslept. Maybe it was a weekend, and no one had woken her up yet. That had happened before. She called out for her mom, quietly at first, then a little louder. No answer. She got out of bed and padded softly across the hall. The carpet felt cold under her feet. She didn't notice the silence in the same way an adult might have. But something inside her began to tense, a soft, internal warning that something wasn't right. Her parents' bedroom door was open, just a crack. She peeked inside. She saw their shapes beneath the blankets. Nothing unusual at first glance. She whispered again. No answer. She stepped away. She walked toward her brother Josh's room. His door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open gently. He was lying still, just like always, but something about the way the blankets were pulled over him seemed wrong. Too perfect, too smooth. She didn't go closer. Something inside her told her not to. Back in the hallway, she stood quietly, unsure of what to do. The house felt colder. She looked toward the stairs and started down, one slow step at a time. Downstairs, everything was in its place. The kitchen counters were clean. No breakfast dishes. No coffee brewing. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. Benny, the family's dog, was sitting in the laundry room, watching her silently. He didn't bark. He didn't move. His tail wagged slowly. She sat down on the couch and hugged a small pillow. She stared at the floor for a long time. Then she stood up and walked to the landline phone hanging in the hallway. Her fingers dialed 911 the way she'd been taught in school. When the dispatcher answered, she said only a few words. "My mom and dad aren't waking up," she said. "They're really still." The voice on the other end asked if she was safe. She said yes. The dispatcher asked if she was hurt. She said no. When asked where she was, she gave her address, calmly, as if reciting something memorized. When police arrived minutes later, they found her exactly where she said she'd be, on the living room floor, hugging a pillow, her legs folded under her. She didn't cry. She didn't run toward them. She simply looked up, her eyes blank. Officers moved quickly through the house, discovering what Hannah had not fully processed. Her parents, her brother, all gone, each murdered in their beds with surgical precision. Hannah was asked if she remembered anything unusual during the night. She said no. She said she fell asleep listening to the rain, that she didn't hear anything strange, that she didn't wake up at all. She said she thought it was just another normal morning. The forensic team would later confirm there was no sign of sedation in her system. No drugs, no sleep aids, no indication that she had been unconscious or harmed. She had simply slept through everything. This fact alone disturbed even the most seasoned investigators. How could a child sleep through the silent murder of her entire family? Even if the attacks had been silent, surely there would have been some noise, some movement, something. But Hannah claimed to have heard nothing, not even the dog, who had apparently remained silent too. What was even more unsettling was her demeanor. Calm, detached, not in shock in the usual sense. More like someone who was distant from the moment, as though the reality hadn't quite sunk in, or as if she were disconnected from it entirely. In interviews, she repeated the same things, that she had gone to sleep early, that she hadn't gotten up once, that everything felt normal until she woke up and realized something was wrong. She was asked about the note found on her nightstand, the one with the 5 chilling words. She claimed she had never seen it before, didn't recognize the handwriting, didn't know what it meant. She is the chosen one. Those words hovered in the minds of every detective, every forensic analyst, every psychologist brought into the case. The phrasing was deliberate, not random, not written in panic. It carried weight, purpose, as if the killer had left behind a message only they understood. But to Hannah, it meant nothing. She didn't know why she was spared. She didn't know what had happened during the night. All she knew was that she had woken up, and everyone else was gone, and somehow the silence felt louder than anything she had ever heard. The forensic team arrived shortly after the initial responders, accompanied by detectives from the county's major crimes unit. The house had already been secured. No signs of break-in. No alarms tripped. Nothing visibly disturbed or misplaced. At first glance, the scene could have passed for a normal morning in a quiet home. But within the walls of that house, death had moved with precision. John and Melissa Myers were found in their bedroom on the first floor, lying in their bed. The blankets had been pulled up neatly to their chests. Both were positioned flat on their backs, heads turned slightly toward each other. Their eyes were closed. Neither showed signs of a struggle or even awareness. Their throats had been slit in a single, clean motion, deep enough to sever the carotid arteries and render them unconscious in seconds. No defensive wounds were present on either body. No bruising. No broken fingernails. It was as if they'd never woken up. Forensic specialists found no indication of sedation, no injected chemicals, no traces of sleeping pills or gas. Toxicology would later confirm that both had gone to bed healthy and sober. They had simply never awakened. The bed sheets beneath them were soaked through with blood, but the pattern told its own story. Contained, almost tidy, with minimal spatter beyond the direct area of contact. Whoever had done this had worked with experience and focus. No rage, no haste, only control. Josh Myers, the 16-year-old son, was discovered upstairs in his bedroom. He, too, was lying in bed, one arm resting across his chest. His position mirrored the stillness found downstairs. The wound to his throat matched the others in depth and direction. Unlike his parents, Josh had a faint abrasion on his right wrist, barely noticeable, but enough to suggest he may have stirred in the final seconds. The cut had been delivered with the same precision. Experts noted that the killer must have known how to locate vital arteries and execute the task with a steady hand. The blade had entered at a calculated angle. There was no hacking, no sawing, just one motion, fatal and final. Blood pooled beneath his pillow, staining the mattress. No signs of struggle in the room. His phone was on the nightstand, his earbuds unworn. A book lay open on his chest, its pages untouched by blood. There were no fingerprints, none belonging to anyone outside the family. No foreign DNA, no unusual fibers. The windows were locked from the inside. The back door was latched. The front door, though unlocked when police arrived, bore no sign of forced entry. It was still unclear whether it had been left open intentionally or if the killer had exited calmly, locking nothing behind them. The hallway lights were off. No motion sensors activated during the night. The home's alarm system, installed 2 years earlier, had been deactivated manually by code. John Myers was the only one who knew the code aside from Melissa. No record indicated it had been changed. There were no signs of damage to the control panel. Whoever entered had done so quietly and with full knowledge of how to avoid detection. The dog, Benny, remained a puzzle of his own. A Labrador mixed with a reputation for barking at the slightest knock. He hadn't made a sound. Found in the laundry room, unharmed, he showed no signs of sedation or fear. The door had been left slightly open, as if someone had gently guided him inside and walked away. No claw marks, no whining, just a silent witness who had seen nothing or had seen too much to tell. In Hannah's room, nothing was touched. Her bed was unrumpled, her stuffed animals neatly arranged. The only anomaly was a slip of paper left on her nightstand, torn from a notebook. No smudges, no creases, just a clean piece of lined paper with 5 words written in black ink. She is the chosen one. Handwriting analysis revealed little. The lettering was precise and uniform. No clear slant, no stylistic quirks. Not rushed, not shaky. It appeared to be written by someone calm, deliberate, and possibly trained to avoid leaving identifying marks. No fingerprints were found on the paper. The phrase itself became a point of obsession for investigators. What did it mean? Was it symbolic? Random? A religious reference? A psychological signature? It didn't fit any known criminal pattern. It wasn't a recognizable quote or code. It was simply there, like the killer had wanted it seen. Nothing else in the house offered a clue. The family computer held no strange searches, no suspicious emails. Their phones showed no threatening messages, no unknown contacts. Melissa's school paperwork was organized on the kitchen table. John's tool belt hung by the back door. Everything suggested that the family had ended the night with routine, until something unthinkable shattered it in the dark. The autopsies confirmed what the crime scene hinted at. Death had come quickly. The killer had known exactly where to cut, how deep, and when. There was no time for panic, no time to scream. Whoever did it moved through the house like a shadow, vanishing before the morning light. There were no signs of robbery, no ransacked drawers, no missing valuables. This was not about money. It wasn't random. It wasn't messy. It was intentional. And what made it all the more disturbing was that, in the middle of that silent night, one person had been left alive. One person untouched, unstirred, and seemingly unafraid. 9-year-old Hannah Myers, alone in a house of death, asleep through it all. And beside her, the words the killer chose to leave behind. When officers from the Ashwood Police Department first arrived at the Myers residence, they did so expecting a routine welfare check. The dispatcher had relayed that a young girl had called, saying her parents wouldn't wake up. It wasn't uncommon for children to panic over something as simple as a late morning or parents sleeping in. But within minutes of stepping into the house, that assumption vanished. The air inside was unnaturally still. Officers noted the absence of movement, noise, or any signs of morning activity. The lights were off. The smell of copper in the air, faint but unmistakable, hinted at something more serious. Training and instinct kicked in. Within seconds, the responding officers confirmed what would soon become a high-profile triple homicide. Standard protocol followed. Officers secured the scene, ushered Hannah into a separate area, and began a slow, methodical sweep of the home. One officer contacted dispatch to request immediate backup, including detectives and forensic personnel. The others moved through the house, documenting what they saw, being careful not to disturb potential evidence. They kept their voices low. Even early into the investigation, the atmosphere was heavy with the awareness that something deeply abnormal had taken place. Within half an hour, the first detectives from the county arrived. Word spread quickly, and soon the modest home on Maple Street was cordoned off with crime scene tape. Curious neighbors began to gather at a distance, whispering among themselves, try and make sense of the unfolding tragedy. News hadn't broken yet, but the flashing lights and influx of marked vehicles hinted at something serious. Detective Sarah Linwood was one of the first on scene, a seasoned investigator with 2 decades on the force. She would later describe the Myers case as unlike anything she had encountered before. It wasn't just the crime itself, It was the quietness of it, the order, the lack of typical indicators. Most homicide scenes carried chaos. This one carried calculation. As the scene was surveyed in greater detail, the investigators started piecing together a rough timeline. According to neighbors, the family had been seen the day before. Around 5 p.m. Melissa was gardening in the front yard. John was washing his truck. There had been no visitors, no reported arguments, no strange noises overnight. No one had noticed anything out of the ordinary. The call from Hannah came at 7:53 a.m. First responders arrived at 8:02 a.m. By then, the killer, or killers, were long gone. Officers began questioning the immediate neighbors. None had seen or heard anything suspicious. One mentioned hearing rain around midnight, but nothing else. Another recalled seeing the family's porch light off by 10. No one had seen cars pulling up late at night. No one reported strange behavior or unfamiliar individuals. Attention turned to the home security features. The Myers family had a basic alarm system installed, purchased after a local burglary 2 years prior. The control panel, located by the front door, was deactivated at some point before midnight. Records showed it was turned off manually using the correct code. No signs of damage, no hacking attempts. The killer had either known the code or had found a way to bypass the system entirely. Investigators also noted the absence of forced entry. The front door showed no scratches, dents, or pry locks. Windows were all shut and latched. The back door, leading to a small patio, was locked from the inside. The possibility of someone already being inside the house the previous evening began to take shape, though no evidence yet supported or disproved that theory. The family's electronics were examined. John's work laptop, Melissa's school-issued tablet, and Josh's gaming console showed normal usage up until around 10:30 p.m. that night. No unauthorized logins. No unusual searches. Their phones were all located near their respective bodies. Each device's call and message logs appeared routine. No signs of threats or strange communication. Hannah's room was treated delicately. Officers ensured she remained unaware of the detailed scene until a guardian or child advocate could be brought in. In her room, other than the ominous note, everything was untouched. Forensics confirmed there was no blood transfer into her sheets, clothes, or floor. Supporter claimed that she hadn't left the bed during the night. The note itself became a critical focus. It had been left with intention, placed where it would be found easily, beside the girl who had somehow been left unharmed. The message, "She is the chosen one," defied the usual logic of homicide cases. It didn't imply rage or theft. It suggested selection, as though the murders had a greater, unknown purpose. The question haunted everyone who read it. Why was she chosen? Local police quickly escalated the case to the state level, realizing the complexity and unusual nature of the crime. The FBI was notified, and a behavioral analysis team was contacted. The idea that the killings were the work of an individual acting alone began to blur. The level of skill required, the planning, the emotional control, all pointed to something more than a spontaneous act. Initial interviews with Hannah were recorded and reviewed by multiple professionals. Child psychologists were brought in to evaluate her state of mind. Her answers remained consistent. She had gone to bed, fallen asleep listening to rain, and woke up to a quiet house. She hadn't heard a door open. She hadn't heard screams. She hadn't seen anything. What disturbed the investigators the most was not what she said, but how she said it, without tears, without fear, without confusion. Calm, almost distant. As the sun rose higher over Ashwood that day, it brought no clarity, only more questions. The first few hours of any homicide investigation are considered the most critical. Leads are fresh. Evidence is unspoiled. Memories are sharp. But in the case of the Myers family, those precious early hours revealed nothing. No enemies, no suspects, no motive, just a silent house. 3 lives ended, and one small girl left behind, untouched, and perhaps chosen for reasons no one yet understood. As the forensics team began their meticulous work inside the Myers residence, the early results only deepened the mystery. Every square inch of the home was photographed, logged, and analyzed. Samples were taken from floors, walls, doorknobs, bedding, and furniture. Yet Despite the extent of the investigation, the evidence, or lack thereof, told a story more disturbing than anyone expected. All three victims, John, Melissa, and Josh Myers, had been killed in their sleep by a single incision across the throat. Autopsies confirmed that the cuts had been precise, consistent in angle and depth, and delivered with enough force to cause near-instant death. No hesitation marks. No second attempts. Just clean, controlled cuts, one per victim. Medical examiners noted that the killer likely possessed anatomical knowledge, possibly medical or paramedical training. The placement of the incisions was identical across all three bodies, slicing through the carotid artery and jugular vein with minimal deviation. According to the forensic pathologist report, the probability that these wounds were inflicted by someone without training or prior experience was extremely low. Even more perplexing was the absence of defensive wounds. None of the victims had bruises, abrasions, or signs of struggle. Fingernails were intact, and skin under the nails showed no trace of foreign DNA. It was as though each had died in complete stillness, without a moment of resistance. Toxicology tests came back negative for sedatives, narcotics, or any substances that could have incapacitated them beforehand. This detail baffled investigators. How could three people, healthy, alert, and presumably aware, be murdered one by one without waking each other or fighting back, especially in a home not particularly large, where sound typically carried easily from room to room? The forensic team conducted a detailed blood pattern analysis in each bedroom. Blood stains were largely confined to the beds. The spatter patterns were minimal, indicating the wounds had been inflicted while the victims were lying still. No signs of erratic blood trails, smeared footprints, or panic movements were found. There was no tracking of blood between rooms. Whoever carried out the murders had done so without disturbing the space. No bloody footprints were discovered leading away from the crime scenes. This was significant. The killer had managed to avoid stepping in or spreading blood across any other part of the house. Forensic luminol sweeps of the floors, staircases, and hallway returned only one faint trace, a partial shoe print near the foot of Josh's bed, just outside the line of visible blood. It wasn't clear enough to yield a make or size, but confirmed the presence of someone moving with caution. Surfaces throughout the home were dusted for fingerprints. Nearly every identifiable print belonged to a member of the Myers family. Only two partial latent prints could not be matched, both found on the exterior frame of the back door, too incomplete to identify, but clearly not linked to the residence. Investigators couldn't determine whether the prints were fresh or left from some unrelated prior contact. The family's electronics yielded no clues. The home computer's internet history showed searches for school schedules, home improvement videos, and grocery coupons. Nothing alarming. John's phone logs revealed routine calls to co-workers and family. Melissa's phone was mostly filled with school group messages and reminders. Josh's phone had messages from friends about homework and video games. Hannah's room underwent the same level of forensic examination. Her bedding, clothing, and belongings were untouched. No blood transfer, no fingerprints not already accounted for. The note, however, drew the greatest attention. Written on a 3-inch by 5-inch piece of ruled paper, it was torn cleanly from what appeared to be a standard spiral notebook. The writing was precise, uppercase, and uniform, using a black gelling pen. She is the chosen one. The paper bore no fingerprints, no smudges, and no signs of having been folded or carried in a pocket. It had likely been written shortly before being placed. No matching paper or pen was found in the house. Ink analysis suggested it was a commercially available pen, but did not narrow the source further. Handwriting analysts described the script as intentionally neutral, suggesting the writer had deliberately masked their natural style. Forensic psychologists reviewed the phrasing. The use of chosen one implied intent and meaning, not random or panic wording. It carried ritualistic or symbolic undertones. Combined with the surgical nature of the murders, some speculated a possible belief-driven motive, perhaps cult-related or a delusional fixation. DNA testing on the note produced no results. The paper was likely handled with gloves. No skin cells, no saliva, no foreign hairs were detected. A clean object, left deliberately by someone who knew how to avoid leaving a trace. The absence of digital evidence frustrated investigators. No strange browser history. No GPS anomalies. No unexpected Wi-Fi connections. Security system logs showed the system had been deactivated at 10:17 p.m., consistent with the Myers' usual bedtime. The code used to disarm it matched the one John had registered. No sign of tampering or remote access. The dog, Benny, showed no signs of physical contact. A veterinary checkup found no tranquilizers or injuries. Behavioral specialists reviewed his behavior, which was reportedly calm and normal in the hours after the murders. How the killer managed to move through the house, enter 3 bedrooms, and commit 3 murders without alerting the dog remained a mystery. All paths of physical evidence led to the same conclusion. The killer had been extremely careful. No blood trail, no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, no digital footprint, no sound. It wasn't just that the killer had avoided making mistakes. It was that they had anticipated them, planned for them, acted with a level of discipline and skill rarely seen in home invasions or domestic homicides. Whoever entered the Myers home that night had done so with a clear plan, a practiced hand, and a message to leave behind. And so far, that message was the only trace they left. In the hours and days following the murders, one question overshadowed every other detail. Why was Hannah left alive? The child had been sleeping in the same house where 3 people were killed in close succession in near total silence, with no signs of resistance or alarm. Yet she remained unharmed, unawakened, and untouched. For investigators, it was both an anomaly and a focal point. In most cases involving home invasions or family-targeted killings, the outcomes are tragically uniform. No survivors, or if there are, there is a clear reason why. But in the case of the Myers family, Hannah's survival did not follow any familiar pattern. Early speculation circled around the possibility of oversight. Maybe the killer simply didn't know she was there. Perhaps they thought she was sleeping at a friend's house or hadn't seen the additional bedroom. But this theory quickly collapsed under scrutiny. Hannah's bedroom was clearly marked with her name in decorative wooden letters on the door. Her shoes were near the entryway. Her school backpack was in plain sight. Her presence was obvious. Even more telling was a note left on her nightstand. She is the chosen one. It wasn't an oversight. It was an intention. Whoever committed the murders had not only known Hannah was there, but had specifically acknowledged her and spared her. This realization shifted the direction of the investigation entirely. Child psychologists brought in to observe Hannah found her demeanor to be quiet, composed, and unusually calm. She exhibited no signs of acute stress disorder, which would have been expected in a child her age exposed to such trauma. While trauma can manifest differently in children, her detachment raised red flags. Some professionals describe her behavior as flat, while others found her stillness more unsettling than any visible distress might have been. In interview sessions, she gave consistent answers. She had gone to bed after reading. She had not awakened during the night. She had not heard any sounds, not even the family dog. She had not seen anyone in the house. She denied knowing about the note, denied ever hearing the phrase, chosen one before, and could not recognize the handwriting. She also claimed she didn't have bad dreams, didn't feel scared, didn't want to talk about what had happened. It was the absence of fear that stood out most. Investigators began to consider whether Hannah might have known the killer, someone she trusted, someone who entered the home without alarming her. But the forensic evidence offered no link to family, friends, or neighbors. Background checks revealed no threats, no disputes, no custody issues, no strange individuals in the family's orbit. There were no signs of grooming, no history of mental health diagnoses, no religious affiliations that suggested cult involvement, and no documented behavioral concerns at Hannah's school. Her teachers described her as polite, quiet, and observant, intelligent but withdrawn. She had few close friends, preferred solo activities like drawing and reading, and rarely spoke unless asked a direct question. If she did know the killer, she was either unwilling or psychologically unable to reveal it. But if she didn't, if the killer was a stranger, then the sparing of her life became all the more perplexing. Behavioral analysts weighed in. They considered whether the killer might be experiencing a messiah complex or delusion that cast Hannah in a symbolic role. The phrase, the chosen one, was ripe with psychological weight. It implied selection. Value. Future purpose. To leave a child alive, intentionally, under such a title suggested a motive that went far beyond revenge or opportunistic violence. It suggested a belief system, however disturbed, where Hannah's survival was not a mistake, but a requirement. Theories multiplied. One suggested the killer had observed the family for a long time and believed Hannah possessed some quality worth preserving. Another speculated that the murders were a form of purification or sacrifice, and Hannah was being set apart. Some investigators hypothesized that she might have been targeted for abduction, but the plan changed. Others leaned toward the idea of a delusional obsession, someone who believed they were saving her. None of these theories could be confirmed, and Hannah's silence offered no further insight. What made the question even more difficult to answer was a complete lack of similar cases. No other crimes in the region or nationally matched the specific pattern of the Myers murders. No anonymous letters, no manifestos, no digital breadcrumbs. This wasn't a case that fit into any known typology. It wasn't ritualistic in the traditional sense. It didn't follow the logic of serial offenders. There was no obvious sexual, financial, or ideological motive. And most importantly, it didn't end in the total erasure of the family. Instead, it ended with a message and a single child left behind, untouched, carrying no knowledge of what had happened, or perhaps knowing something so deep that even she couldn't access it. Investigators considered the long-term risk. If Hannah had been spared for a reason, was it possible the killer would return? Was this the beginning of a long game, a carefully constructed story in which Hannah played a central role? Protective measures were put in place. The child was moved into custody with her maternal aunt in another state. Law enforcement maintained close monitoring in the background. Psychologists continued periodic evaluations, watching for signs. Any sign that Hannah knew more than she claimed. Still, years passed without clarity. The killer had taken 3 lives without leaving a trace, had bypassed alarm systems, avoided triggering the dog, and left behind nothing except a note that only deepened the mystery. And in the center of it all, a quiet 9-year-old girl who had somehow survived without seeing or hearing anything and yet had been chosen. The question remained unanswered. Why Hannah? And perhaps more chillingly, for what? The first formal statement from Hannah Myers was taken less than 24 hours after the bodies of her parents and brother were discovered. It was conducted in the presence of a child psychologist, 2 investigators, and a family protection officer. The room was quiet. The questions were gentle, phrased carefully, paced slowly. The objective wasn't just information. It was to observe how she processed and responded under structured, compassionate inquiry. Her responses were consistent with what she had initially told the 911 dispatcher. She said she went to sleep after 9:30 p.m. on March 11th. She remembered reading a book under the covers until her eyes got heavy. She didn't recall turning off the light, but she believed it had been shut off, possibly by her mom, as was often the routine. She said she fell asleep listening to the rain. When asked what she heard that night, she answered with clarity, nothing. She didn't hear doors creak, no voices, no footsteps, no shouting, no dog barking, not even movement. She said she slept deeply, woke up when it was already light. The house, she explained, felt too quiet. But at first, she thought it was just because everyone was still sleeping. She called out to her mother, got no answer, and walked into the hallway. The rest, she said, felt like a dream I didn't want. When questioned about the note found on her nightstand, she appeared confused. The detective showed her a scanned copy. She looked at it for several seconds before responding, I didn't write that. I don't know who did. Her tone, by all reports, was flat, not frightened, not defensive, simply matter of fact. She denied having ever seen the phrase, she is the chosen one before. When asked what it might mean, she simply shrugged. Follow-up questions tested her recognition of the handwriting. She confirmed it was not hers. When asked if it looked familiar, perhaps a teacher's, a parent's, or someone else's, she shook her head. The investigators pressed gently about the previous days. Had she seen anyone unusual near the house? Any vehicles parked outside that she didn't recognize? Had anyone spoken to her recently in a way that made her feel uncomfortable? She answered no to each. She had walked home from school with her brother. They ate dinner. She watched a cartoon. Her father checked on her before bedtime. There was no sign, she said, that anything bad was going to happen. The psychologist conducting the session later reported that Hannah's memory seemed either tightly compartmentalized or unnaturally unbothered. She did not display the expected signs of trauma for a child who had just lost her entire family under violent circumstances. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. Her hands remained folded in her lap. Her voice was calm. Experts debated the meaning of this composure. Some believed it was a form of dissociation, a subconscious psychological mechanism that numbs emotional response in the face of unbearable stress. Others considered that she may have blocked the event entirely from her conscious awareness, especially as she had awakened briefly during the murders and then repressed a memory. A small subset raised a more unsettling possibility, that Hannah knew more than she was willing or able to say. When asked to draw what she remembered from that night, she sketched her bedroom, a childlike but detailed drawing, complete with her bookshelf, her nightstand, and the stuffed rabbit she slept with. There was no indication of anything abnormal in the drawing. No dark figures. No suggestion of fear or intrusion. She included a small, square-shaped paper on the nightstand, just beside the lamp. The note, when asked why she added it to the drawing, if she didn't remember seeing it until the next morning, she paused. Then she said, "It was there when I woke up." That was all. Investigators tried to explore this further. Did she think someone came into her room? Did she remember anyone standing near her bed? Had she ever had dreams about someone speaking to her at night? Her answers remained brief and unyielding. "No, I don't know. I don't remember." When asked directly whether she had ever seen her family harmed or heard anything unusual in the house, her voice didn't change. "No, I didn't see anything. I just woke up and everything was quiet." From a legal perspective, her statement offered no leads, no names, no descriptions, no suspicions. But from a psychological standpoint, it became a point of contention. Some professionals believed she was suppressing memory as a survival mechanism. Others suspected something more complex, that her memory may have been manipulated, either internally through trauma or externally by influence. Authorities reviewed her past medical history, looking for neurological issues, sleep disorders, or evidence of prior psychological trauma. Nothing emerged. She had never been treated for dissociation, night terrors, or amnesia. She had no reported history of abuse or trauma. No psychiatric red flags. Her school counselor noted she was bright but introverted, the kind of child who kept thoughts to herself. She was imaginative but not prone to fantasy or delusion. There had been no incidents at school, no bullying, no disciplinary action. Investigators found themselves circling the same frustrating point. If Hannah had no knowledge of the event, then the killer had somehow entered the home, murdered 3 people, and exited, without alerting the dog, the alarms, or the only conscious person in the house. And if Hannah did know something, if she had seen or heard something but buried it, then there was no way to retrieve it, at least not yet. The official statement was cataloged, reviewed, and cross-verified with forensic findings. It held together logically. But emotionally, it left a vacuum. The child's detachment, her neutral tone, and her refusal to speculate suggested either extraordinary resilience or a blankness too complete to be natural. In either case, Hannah's testimony created more questions than answers. She didn't wake up. She didn't see anyone. She didn't know who wrote the note. She didn't remember anything unusual. Yet she was the only one left alive. In the days following the murders, the town of Ashwood shifted from shock to unease. What began as whispered disbelief quickly evolved into a climate of suspicion and quiet fear. The idea that such a brutal crime had occurred, without explanation, without warning, without a single witness, shook the community at its core. Small towns are built on predictability and trust, and now both had been upended. People who once left their doors unlocked began double-bolting them. Curtains were drawn during the day. Children were kept inside. The sound of a car passing after dark made people look out their windows. The Myers family had represented the best of Ashwood. Stable, kind, unremarkable in the safest way. If it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. In the absence of answers, the rumors began. Some were simple speculation. People asked why the dog hadn't barked, or how a killer could have moved through a house without anyone waking up. Others latched onto more unsettling theories. They talked about the note. That phrase, "she is the chosen one," was repeated in hushed conversations at gas stations, in grocery store lines, outside churches. Everyone had their own version of what it meant. Some believed it was a cult killing. They spoke of old legends, secret groups, forgotten rituals. Though no evidence ever supported this idea, it grew rapidly, feeding off the town's discomfort with the silence surrounding the case. When no arrests were made, some began to believe the killer had never left Ashwood. Others focused on Hannah. The girl became a source of both sympathy and unease. Initially, there was widespread support. Flowers and teddy bears were left at the police station. Cards were sent to the temporary guardian's house. But over time, the narrative changed. Her calmness, so unsettling to investigators, also affected the town. Whispers began. Why hadn't she cried? Why hadn't she screamed? How could a 9-year-old sleep through the murder of her family? Some wondered if she had seen more than she admitted. A few went further, entertaining the idea that she might have been involved or used. There was no evidence to support any of it, but in a town that relied on explanations, silence was a breeding ground for fear. Church leaders addressed the tragedy in sermons. Pastors reminded their congregations to seek peace in uncertainty, to offer compassion rather than judgment. But even these messages couldn't prevent the growing discomfort. People wanted the story to fit something they understood: revenge, robbery, a stranger passing through. But it didn't. Law enforcement held a town hall meeting a week after the murders. The goal was to provide reassurance and clarify what could be shared publicly. The sheriff stood before a crowd of nearly 200 residents, giving carefully measured answers. He emphasized that the investigation was ongoing, that no suspects had been ruled out, and that Hannah was not under suspicion. The note, he confirmed, was still being analyzed. No one outside of law enforcement had touched it. The phrase it contained, he said, had no known connection to any local groups or ideologies. But that did little to calm the room. People left that evening with more questions than they arrived with. The media attention added fuel to the uncertainty. National networks picked up the story, labeling it the Ashwood Silence. News vans lined the streets. Reporters interviewed neighbors, and articles speculated wildly. The town, once known for its logging heritage and quiet forest trails, was now synonymous with an unsolved triple murder and a cryptic message. Journalists knocked on doors and approached residents in parking lots. Most refused to speak, but a few gave statements, expressing sorrow, confusion, and, more often, worry. The lack of progress in the investigation made it worse. Each passing day without answers gave more weight to rumors. Some parents began pulling their children out of school. Enrollment at Ashwood Elementary dropped temporarily by nearly 18%. The school counselor reported an increase in anxiety, nightmares, and behavioral issues among students, even those not connected to Myers' family. The community's sense of safety, once assumed, had eroded. Hannah's location was kept confidential, but it didn't stop people from trying to find out. Online forums speculated about where she had been moved. Some claimed to have seen her in nearby towns, though none of the sightings were confirmed. A few conspiracy-minded locals believed she was being protected by the government or studied by psychologists for something abnormal. The police, bound by protocol and limited by lack of evidence, could say little. The FBI's involvement added credibility, but also intensified the mystery. Federal agents were seen entering the home multiple times over several weeks. Forensic vans remained parked in front of the Myers residence for days. To neighbors, it suggested something bigger, something they weren't being told. With no public suspects, the list of potential culprits in the minds of residents expanded. Some looked to former employees at the lumber mill. Others recalled a traveling preacher who had passed through town months earlier. One theory involved a local hunter who lived off-grid in the surrounding woods. Each theory took on a life of its own, rarely supported by fact. Time passed, but the story didn't fade. Ashwood never forgot. The house on Maple Street remained empty. No family moved in. No one asked to buy it. The property became a kind of unspoken landmark, proof that something unspeakable had happened in a place where nothing ever happened. And at the center of it all was a girl left behind. A girl who spoke softly, who remembered nothing, and who, somehow, had been spared. In a town that no longer felt like itself, Hannah became both a symbol of survival and a reminder that the most terrifying mysteries aren't always found in the dark, but in the questions that remain when the silence is all that's left. The 5 words written on the piece of paper found on Hannah's nightstand, "She is a chosen one," became the linchpin of the investigation. In a case devoid of motive, witnesses, or physical evidence linking a suspect to crime, the note offered the only direct message from the perpetrator. It was carefully placed, cleanly written, and deliberately cryptic. Linguists, forensic psychologists, and criminal profilers were all brought in to interpret its possible meaning. The note was printed in block capital letters, evenly spaced, using a black gel ink pen. There were no smudges, pressure marks, or mistakes. The paper itself was standard, a tear out from a lined notepad commonly sold in office supply stores. It carried no watermarks or manufacturing codes that could help trace it. Despite the simplicity of the medium, the message was the opposite: deeply layered, emotionally provocative, and strategically left behind. Forensic linguists examined every aspect of the phrasing. The use of the third person, "she is," rather than "you are," or simply "chosen one," suggested that the killer was communicating to an audience beyond Hannah. It was not a private note meant only for her eyes. It was a label, a declaration, or possibly a message for investigators. The passive tone implied fate or destiny, not action. There was no threat, no direct instruction, just identity. The word "chosen" triggered immediate associations with religious or ideological connotations. In various historical and theological contexts, the chosen one refers to a person set apart for a unique purpose, often divine, sacrificial, or redemptive. This led some analysts to theorize the killer held delusional beliefs, possibly centered around spiritual elevation or purification. However, no religious symbols or writings were found in the home, and no communication from fringe groups or extremist cults ever surfaced in relation to the crime. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit ran the phrase through databases containing manifestos, criminal letters, and online forums linked to ideologically motivated violence. Nothing matched. The handwriting also did not resemble any samples from previous unsolved crimes. Criminal profilers suggested the note could serve 3 possible psychological functions: explanation, justification, or provocation. If it was an explanation, the killer may have believed the murders were necessary in order to preserve Hannah or fulfill a purpose connected to her. This theory leaned heavily into the idea that the killers saw themselves not as a villain, but as a guardian or even savior. Sparing Hannah was not mercy, but mission, if it was a justification. The message could be an attempt to rationalize the horror of the act. The killer may have needed to impose logic on illogical, masking the violence behind a layer of symbolic meaning. By calling Hannah the chosen one, they could distance themselves from brutality, suggesting a larger design. If it was a provocation, the killer may have wanted to create a riddle, something that would haunt investigators and keep the case alive. In this view, the message was a control mechanism, a psychological anchor left behind not for the girl, but for those chasing shadows in her wake. Some theorize that the note was meant to manipulate Hannah directly. The phrase itself, while cryptic, had the kind of linguistic weight that could imprint on a child's developing psyche. It cast her into a role she had not asked for, one she did not understand. Over time, the knowledge that someone had deliberately spared her and called her chosen might shape her identity. Through confusion, fear, or obsession, others argued that the note was not about Hannah at all, but about the killer's own delusion. It could reflect a mental disorder, possibly schizophrenia or psychotic break, where the killer believed they were acting on divine or universal instruction. In this framework, Hannah was incidental. Her survival was a result of an internal script being followed, one with roles and symbols known only to the killer. A separate theory pointed to the possibility of a personal obsession. If the killer had been watching the family, following them, learning their routines, it was possible that Hannah had become an object of fixation. The note then wasn't religious, but relational. Chosen could reflect a twisted form of attachment or idealization. The murders would then be a perverse method of removing perceived obstacles, her family, while preserving the object of focus. Psychiatrists who reviewed the case emphasized that the calculated nature of the killings contrasted sharply with what would be expected in most psychotic episodes. There was no chaos at the crime scene, no erratic behavior, no evidence of impulsivity. Everything had been done with control, planning, and deliberate silence. Law enforcement issued a public request for information related to Phrase. A tip line was created specifically for people who might have heard that wording used in cults, literature, or personal communication. Hundreds of messages were received, most unrelated, some speculative, a few worth follow-up. None led to an arrest or a credible suspect. Online, the note took on a life of its own. True crime forums dissected it, debated its meaning, and linked it to obscure passages from literature, mythology, and religious texts. Several amateur sleuths attempted linguistic pattern matching with known cases, but no verifiable connections were established. The mystery of the note deepened as the investigation stalled. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no surveillance footage. The killer had moved with surgical precision, and yet they had chosen to leave behind this one thing, a single handwritten message. She is the chosen one. It wasn't just a clue. It was a disruption, a fracture in the logical sequence of violence. In a case built on silence, it was the only voice. And whether it was a warning, a signature, or a prophecy, its meaning remained just out of reach, hanging in the air like a question no one could answer. As the investigation moved into its second month, the absence of leads forced law enforcement to turn inward, into detailed profiling, strategic theorizing, and the slow, deliberate construction of psychological and logistical frameworks. With physical evidence nearly non-existent and digital traces inconclusive, the investigative team shifted toward understanding the why and how behind the murders, hoping those paths would lead to the who. Multiple working theories emerged, each pursued by specialized units and consulted experts. While none could be definitively proven, they represented the core directions of law enforcement thought as the case deepened. Theory 1. Professional killer with psychological deviance. The precision of the killings, the lack of struggle, the identical method of execution, the unbroken silence, suggests a level of control rarely seen outside of professional or military backgrounds. Forensic analysts noted the consistency in the neck wounds, drawing parallels to techniques taught in tactical environments, such as close-quarters combat training. In this theory, the killer could have been a trained individual with experience in stealth, entry, and dispatch, possibly former military, special forces, or even a contractor familiar with silent infiltration techniques. The theory accounts for the efficiency, the lack of mistakes, and the absence of forensic residue. What made this hypothesis more unsettling was its fusion with a psychological element. Despite a calculated method, the killer left behind a cryptic note with symbolic language, implying emotional or ideological motivation. This blend of cold precision and abstract meaning placed the killer outside traditional typologies, a hybrid of organized killer and mission-driven actor. Theory 2. Targeted ritual or belief-driven crime. The presence of the phrase, "she is the chosen one," introduced the possibility of a ritualistic or belief-based motive. Behavioral analysts examined the psychological profiles of known cult leaders, delusional religious offenders, and belief-based criminal acts that involved children or purity symbolism. This theory suggested the killer viewed the murders not as ends in themselves, but as components of a broader narrative. In this framework, the family may have been seen as an impediment or sacrifice, and Hannah as a figure symbolically or spiritually important. However, the lack of accompanying symbols, objects, or writings traditionally associated with ritualistic crimes complicated this angle. Cults or belief-based crimes often leave behind iconography, specific rituals, or messages to validate their belief system. Here, the crime was surgically clean, no symbols, no known ideological claims, no previous manifestos or threats. Investigators theorize the absence of such signs could be intentional, pointing to a private or delusional belief system followed only by the perpetrator. Alternatively, it could suggest that this was merely the beginning of something larger, an initiation, a trial, or a first act in a broader plan yet to unfold. Theory 3. Obsession with the child. Several FBI consultants raised a theory of focused obsession. In this model, the killer developed a long-term fixation on Hannah, possibly after observing her at school, in public, or through online exposure. The note's phrasing, paired with her sparing, was consistent with what psychologists call selective fixation, where an offender built a cognitive fantasy around one individual. This theory framed the murders as secondary, obstacles eliminated to preserve or claim the object of obsession. It paralleled some known cases of abduction or grooming, where perpetrators removed parents or guardians to isolate a child, though the full killing scene in the Myers case were far more extreme. Yet the crime didn't follow with an abduction or attempted contact. Hannah remained untouched, unapproached, and physically unharmed. This deviation from the expected behavior of obsessional offenders puzzled analysts. If the goal was to take the girl, why leave her? If the goal was to worship her from afar, why leave a message at all? Some suggested the act may have been rehearsed mentally for years, a fantasy so structured that once carried out, the killer found completion itself sufficient. Others suspected that the killer might return, which prompted increased protective measures around Hannah's location and identity. Theory 4. Familial or close acquaintance offender. Despite the professionalism of the crime, some detectives argue for a theory rooted in proximity. Statistically, family members or close acquaintances commit the majority of homicides. The fact that the security system was disarmed with the correct code, that the dog did not bark, and that there were no signs of panic, pointed to someone familiar, someone the Myers trusted. Background checks into extended family, co-workers, old friends, and school contacts were expanded. Financial records, life insurance policies, property disputes, and social relationships were examined. No motive emerged. No one stood to gain financially. No family member displayed suspicious behavior. No enemies or feuds were uncovered. Every promising lead ended in a dead end. This theory remained on the table, but evidence to support was thin. It required a close associate to have the training, planning capacity, and psychological detachment to carry out a triple homicide without being detected and without leaving behind any direct trail. Theory 5. The unknown watcher. A more abstract theory posited that the family had been under surveillance long before the murders. Small-town routines, limited privacy, and predictable schedules would have made the Myers a manageable target for someone quietly observing them. If the killer had monitored them for weeks or months, they could have learned entry points, alarm codes, pet behavior, and sleeping patterns. This theory leaned heavily on the idea that the killer was not acting impulsively, but executing a long-devised plan. The family had not done anything to provoke the violence. They were chosen not because of what they had done, but for what the killer believed about them. Hannah, in this view, was the central figure from the start. The phrase "she is a chosen one" would then become less of a post-event justification and more of a pre-existing ideology, a belief reinforced by long-term fixation and silent observation. As the investigation moved forward, law enforcement continued to cycle through these theories, modifying them as new information emerged, or more often, as leads failed to materialize. Each theory answered some questions and raised others. Each offered logic, but not closure. At the center of every path was the same enigma: a child left alive, 3 lives taken without trace, and a message written by someone who understood how to erase every other part of themselves, except the words they wanted to be remembered. In the absence of physical evidence, digital forensics and behavioral profiling began to focus on the possibility of long-term surveillance. If the killer had been watching the Myers family undetected for a significant period before the murders, it could explain the uncanny precision and calm execution of the crime. Investigators began reconstructing the family's routines not only to understand their habits, but to identify possible surveillance points, physical and digital. John Myers was a mid-level insurance agent who followed a structured daily routine. He left home at 8:15 a.m., returned by 5:30 p.m., rarely deviated from his pattern, and made predictable stops: school drop-off, gas station, grocery runs. Melissa, a part-time librarian at the town library, kept a similarly rigid schedule, working Tuesdays through Fridays. Their son Josh had after-school activities twice a week, and Hannah was always home by 3:45 p.m., typically accompanied by her older brother. The family had no history of threats, restraining orders, or social media harassment. They lived modestly, rarely traveled, and had minimal online exposure. But that did not mean they weren't being watched. Investigators began to map out potential vantage points near the Myers residence. The house sat in a quiet cul-de-sac with limited through traffic. Street visibility was partially blocked by 2 maple trees in front of the house, and the backyard faced a small wooded area. From the tree line, someone with basic camouflage or night vision equipment could easily observe the family's habits without detection. Trail camera sweeps found no devices, but any surveillance conducted by the killer likely ended the night of the murders. Door-to-door inquiries among neighbors yielded no reports of suspicious vehicles parked nearby for extended periods. However, a resident 3 blocks away did recall seeing a dark sedan parked near the woods on multiple occasions over the previous few weeks, typically late at night or early morning. No license plate was recorded, and the make or model couldn't be confirmed. Surveillance footage from local traffic cams was checked, but due to the neighborhood's low activity and limited camera coverage, no useful footage was recovered. Attention turned to the family's digital footprint. While the Myers were not heavy internet users, they maintained basic online activities: browsing, emailing, shopping. None of their devices showed signs of malware or remote access tools, but the forensic team noted the absence of login attempts, network anomalies, or browsing behavior during key time frames, particularly the 24 or 48 hours before the murders. This led investigators to believe the killer did not use digital methods for real-time observation. The possibility of physical stalking increased in likelihood. Behavioral profilers theorized that the killer had conducted at least 1 or 2 dry runs. These would allow them to test timing, observe sleeping patterns, understand interior layout, and assess the family's vulnerability without being detected. If so, the perpetrator likely blended in, perhaps as a delivery worker, technician, or even a jogger using the wooded trail near the backyard. The dog, Benny, became a focal point. A family pet typically reacts to the scent or presence of strangers. The absence of barking or distress suggested either familiarity or desensitization. One theory posited that the killer had spent time near the property regularly enough that Benny no longer perceived their presence as a threat. Alternatively, if the dog was trained or conditioned to remain calm through familiarity, the killer may have visited the property frequently, perhaps while the family was away. Further exploration of community security systems revealed a frustrating reality. Very few homes near the Myers residence had active exterior cameras. One neighbor had a functioning motion detection light and camera, but it faced inward toward their own garage and provided no view of the street. A broader scan of local security footage yielded no sightings of unfamiliar individuals entering or exiting the property. It became clear that the killer had likely scouted the environment in advance and deliberately chosen a blind spot. Investigators also explored school-related access points. Hannah's school held multiple open house events and public activities in the months before the murders. If the killer had fixated on her, these events would have allowed anonymous observation. Staff reviewed guest log, volunteer sheets, and security footage from those events. Nothing stood out. No lingering visitors. No repeat attendees without clear purpose. Psychological profiling suggested the killer likely operated with methodical control. Surveillance, in this framework, would not be spontaneous. It would be calculated, consistent, and purpose-driven. The person would be organized, socially functional, and capable of long-term planning. They would avoid impulsive risk. This profile pointed away from random drifters or deranged individuals and towards someone living quietly, perhaps locally, with the ability to blend in and observe unnoticed. This angle further supported the idea that the killer had chosen Hannah Long before the night of the murders. The phrase, "she is a chosen one," gained new weight in light of surveillance theory. The killer may have built a cognitive narrative around the child over time, watching her routines, hearing her speak, observing her behavior, until they convinced themselves that she was special, different, pure, or meant for some greater purpose. Surveillance as an act of control, not merely observation, placed the killer in a psychological category where detachment coexisted with obsession. They may have watched the family not just to plan the crime, but to build the emotional justification for it. By constructing a narrative where Hannah was chosen, they gave themselves permission to act, quietly, completely, and with chilling efficiency. To this day, No direct evidence has confirmed the surveillance theory, but among all law enforcement hypotheses, it remains one of the most coherent. It explains the precision. It explains the lack of mistakes. And it explains the terrifying reality that whoever did this had likely watched the family for a very long time, learning how to be invisible until it was time to be remembered. From the outset, what made the Myers family case distinct was not just brutality or mystery of the act. It was a complete absence of traditional forensic evidence. In modern criminal investigations, even the most meticulous offenders leave behind microscopic clues. Hair strands, partial prints, trace fibers, skin cells, sweat, shoe impressions, tool marks, something. But in this case, the house presented as almost surgically clean. It was not just an absence, it was a vacuum. Crime scene investigators arrived within an hour of the initial call. Standard perimeter sealing was immediate. Entry points, high contact surfaces, and all possible zones of interaction were prioritized. Every room was tested with alternative light sources for biological evidence. Walls, door frames, bed linens, and even a dog's fur were analyzed. Nothing conclusive surfaced. There were no fingerprints, none belonging to anyone other than family members, and one visiting neighbor from 3 days prior. Door handles, faucet knobs, the security system's keypad, and the refrigerator handle yielded nothing foreign. The lack of prints led to the assumption that gloves were used, but even that didn't explain everything. Gloves often leave indirect traces. Pressure marks, displacement of fibers, occasionally trace powder or synthetic residue. No such evidence was recovered. No footprints were found either. No dirt, moisture, or impression on carpet or tile. If the killer wore shoe covers, they were never discarded at the scene. No footprints outside indicated forced entry or stalking. The backyard grass was undisturbed. Rain had fallen during the night, which could explain some degradation, but it did not fully account for the lack of disturbance. DNA swabs were collected from every conceivable surface. Underneath fingernails, behind ears, along windowsills, and on doorknobs. Yet no foreign DNA was recovered. The autopsies confirmed that each family member had been killed swiftly, with no signs of struggle, no bruises consistent with defensive wounds, no blood smears indicating movement or retaliation. Each victim had a single, clean, deep incision to the neck, precisely placed, likely with a blade between 5 and 7 inches in length. The cuts severed the carotid artery and jugular vein with surgical accuracy. This pointed to a killer who had medical knowledge or extensive practice. But even then, some contamination or slip would be expected. The bodies were discovered in their respective beds, undisturbed except for the fatal injuries. The bed sheets were largely unwrinkled. There were no signs of binding or restraint. No blood trails. Just the stains where each person had died. The murder weapon was never found. The cut angle suggested the use of a fixed-blade knife, possibly a combat or hunting knife with high-carbon steel. No such knife was owned by the family or reported missing. Nearby hardware stores and sporting goods shops had no suspicious purchases on record in the previous weeks. No blades matching the estimated profile were recovered in the house, surrounding woods, or town. The method of entry also baffled investigators. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no tampering. The front door had been unlocked when responders arrived, but the internal security system had been disarmed via correct code entry. Surveillance logs from the Myers system showed a proper code entry shortly after 1 a.m. The code belonged to Melissa. She had not shared it, and no recent service technicians had been given access. There were no signs of hacking or wireless override. Investigators concluded that the killer either observed the code being used or coerced it from one of the victims. Though no audio or written threats were recovered, the killer had either rehearsed the break-in or possessed insider knowledge. But this would contradict the absence of suspects among family, friends, and co-workers. Even the family's dog, Benny, a 65-pound golden retriever known to bark at any movement near the house, did not appear to have been agitated. No defensive scratches, no drug traces in its bloodstream, no injuries. The animal remained silent throughout the entire event. The dog's calm was either the result of conditioning, suggesting the killer had visited repeatedly and become familiar, or that it had been sedated using methods undetectable by standard toxicology. Specialists tested for sedatives, tranquilizers, and anesthetics, everything from ketamine to zolazepam. No substances were detected. The sheer lack of disturbance, the absence of chaos, of noise, of resistance, suggested that the murders had occurred in complete silence. Whether victims had been drugged was a consideration. Toxicology screens, however, showed no traces of common sedatives, alcohol, or opiates in any of the victims. Their systems were clean. Digital forensics yielded little. The home's Wi-Fi router had not experienced unusual activity. No smart devices had been accessed or interfered with. The phones of John, Melissa, and Josh had not been used during the night. No calls, no texts, no browser activity. Hannah's tablet had been powered off by 10:02 p.m. and remained untouched until police recovered it. There was no evidence of third-party access, Bluetooth infiltration, or IP conflicts. The killer had not used technology to navigate or manipulate the home. Even the note left on Hannah's nightstand defied forensic examination. No fingerprints, no DNA, no indentation suggesting writing pressure through the underlying sheets. It was written with care and placed precisely, as if by someone who had no doubt what they wanted to say or how to say it. In most crime scenes, investigators work backward. Trace the physical, reconstruct the sequence, isolate the anomalies. But in the Myers case, there was almost nothing to work backward from. The house might as well have been visited by a shadow. This absence forced a haunting conclusion. The killer had anticipated every standard investigative method and nullified it in advance. They didn't just know how to kill. They knew how not to leave a trace. And when all you leave behind is a message and a mystery, the message becomes louder. The silence becomes part of the story. And the story, when missing its physical pieces, begins to feel like something else entirely. Something constructed with intent, but built on absence. As the investigation stalled and media attention gradually turned elsewhere, focus shifted back to the person at the center of the mystery, Hannah Myers, the only survivor. While authorities continued pursuing leads, forensic psychologists, trauma specialists, and child psychiatrists began the long, delicate process of assessing Hannah's mental and emotional state. From a clinical standpoint, Hannah's response to the trauma was both atypical and deeply complex. In the hours and days following the murders, she showed a striking absence of typical PTSD symptoms. There were no episodes of hyperventilation, no disorientation, no severe emotional outbursts. Her answers remained consistent, her affect flat but coherent, and her behavior regulated. To some professionals, this emotional stillness was a red flag. Children who survived traumatic events, especially the violent loss of immediate family, almost always display clear emotional markers. These can range from night terrors and separation anxiety to compulsive reenactment through play or art. Hannah demonstrated none of these in the initial days. Her drawings were neutral. Her sleep, while light, was undisturbed. Her speech was neither withdrawn nor erratic. Such responses raised the possibility of dissociation, a psychological mechanism in which a person disconnects from reality to protect themselves from overwhelming stress. Dissociation in children can manifest in flattened emotions, memory lapses, and a sense of detachment from surroundings. In extreme cases, it can result in the development of alternative identities or complete repression of traumatic events. However, Hannah's psychiatric evaluations did not confirm any dissociative identity markers. Her memory of the day before the murders was intact. Her sense of time was clear. She answered questions logically, showed self-awareness, and engaged with therapists at a level expected of her developmental stage. The lack of a trauma response remained, and it unsettled everyone involved. Some specialists considered the possibility of childhood psychogenic amnesia, where the brain actively blocks access to painful memory. This condition, while rare, can occur in cases where the trauma is so profound that the subconscious refuses to process it. In this view, Hannah may have witnessed something but buried it so deeply that she genuinely could not recall it. Others propose a darker hypothesis, that Hannah had been exposed to psychological manipulation prior to or during the event. If the perpetrator had conditioned her over time, it might explain both the lack of fear and emotional flatness. Though no physical signs of abuse or grooming were found, This possibility remained in the background of all future evaluations. Over the following weeks, Hannah's behavior began to change subtly. She started asking questions, not about the night of the murders, but about the phrase in the note. "What does chosen mean?" she asked the counselor. "Does it mean I'm supposed to do something?" These questions, while understandable, were concerning. They indicated that the message left behind was beginning to take psychological root. Children at that age are highly impressionable. When given abstract labels like special, chosen, or different, they begin constructing internal narratives around those words. Without guidance, such constructs can lead to long-term identity confusion, self-isolation, or delusional thinking. Trauma recovery experts worry that Hannah's future will be shaped not only by what she lost, but by what the killer had chosen to leave behind. Another emerging pattern was Hannah's silence about her family. When asked to talk about her parents or brother, she responded in general terms. "They were nice. We had pancakes sometimes." There was no grief narrative, no longing, no tears. It was as if her emotional connection had been muted. Some therapists viewed this as a coping mechanism. Others found it unsettling. To protect her identity and safety, Hannah was placed in temporary foster care under strict anonymity. She was enrolled under a new name in a different school district, with therapists continuing regular sessions. Reports from a foster family indicated that she was well-behaved, quiet, and academically capable, but unusually private. She rarely initiated interaction and never spoke of her past unless prompted. The possibility of a delayed trauma response loomed large. Psychologists warned that Hannah could begin exhibiting symptoms months or even years later. Survivors of childhood trauma often show no signs in the immediate aftermath, only to develop anxiety disorders, attachment issues, or dissociative conditions later in adolescence. To mitigate this risk, a long-term therapy plan was developed, incorporating trauma-informed care, art therapy, and structured routine. There was also a lingering concern about identity formation. Children form their self-image based on relationships, experiences, and labels. With her entire family gone and the label chosen one inserted at a pivotal developmental stage, Hannah's sense of self was at risk of being shaped more by the crime than by who she had been before it. Left unaddressed, this could lead to maladaptive beliefs about destiny, guilt, or moral responsibility. Law enforcement remained quietly involved. Periodic psychological assessments included questions designed to detect suppressed memories or delayed disclosures. So far, Hannah's answers remained unchanged. She had seen nothing, heard nothing, remembered nothing unusual. From a legal standpoint, she remained a witness without evidence. From a psychological standpoint, she was a case study in ambiguity, neither fully traumatized nor fully unaffected, a child suspended between memory and myth. The danger lay in what came next. If the killer had truly chosen Hannah for a purpose, what was that purpose? Would they attempt contact? Would she remember something that would put her in danger? Or would the note's words continue echoing inside her mind until she began to shape her own meaning from them? In time, Hannah would grow older. Her questions would become sharper. Her memories might return, or they might remain buried. But the psychological imprint had already been made. And as every expert involved quietly agreed, it wasn't just the murders that had to be solved. It was the aftershock left behind in the mind of the only person who survived. The murders of the Myers family and the survival of 9-year-old Hannah triggered a national media storm that quickly evolved into public obsession. Within days of the crime, the case went from local news to front-page headlines on major networks, spawning documentaries, podcasts, YouTube deep dives, Reddit threads, and amateur investigations. In the absence of arrests or clear motive, speculation filled the vacuum left by silence. News outlets initially covered the case with typical restraint. Headlines emphasized the horror. Small town shattered by silent slaughter. Only the daughter survives. The mysterious note found beside Hannah's bed, "She is the chosen one," added a layer of intrigue that guaranteed continued coverage. As law enforcement released limited details, journalists, content creators, and social media users began constructing their own narratives. The first wave of media attention focused on the mechanics of the crime. How had someone entered a suburban home undetected? How had the killer subdued an entire family? without waking the youngest member? Why had no neighbors heard anything? The second wave turned speculative. Who was the killer and what did chosen mean? The third wave, the most damaging, focused on Hannah herself. In the public imagination, Hannah became a symbol, a survivor, a mystery, and for some, a possible key to understanding the killer's motive. Online theorists dissected her facial expressions from old school photos, her body language in blurred images from news footage, and her limited public statements. Some portrayed her as a tragic victim. Others cast her in more unsettling roles, suggesting that she remembered more than she let on, or that she might have been complicit in ways no one understood. Conspiracy theories blossomed. One online community claimed the killings were part of a covert psychological experiment conducted by a secretive government agency. Another insisted the crime was a ritual sacrifice orchestrated by a hidden cult operating in small towns across the country. Dozens of theories revolve around the phrase "chosen one," linking it to obscure passages in the Bible, ancient mythology, and even video game lore. Podcasts devoted multiple episodes to the case. True crime influencers analyzed every known detail, often stretching logic in pursuit of new angles. YouTube channels used AI voiceovers to generate speculative videos filled with ominous music, black screen visuals, and dramatized reconstructions of the crime. Some went as far as to digitally recreate the family home in 3D, suggesting hypothetical entry routes and hidden messages in floor plans. The pressure on law enforcement mounted. Every public briefing was followed by online backlash, accusing the authorities of incompetence, concealment, or complicity. When the police reiterated that Hannah was not a suspect and had been ruled out early in the investigation, some commenters accused them of lying. Petitions circulated demanding that the full note be released, believing it might contain hidden symbols or coded language. Despite efforts to protect Hannah's identity, her name eventually leaked. A popular crime podcast obtained and aired an interview with a distant relative, which included enough personal detail for internet users to track down her temporary residence. The leak forced officials to relocate her under tighter security, and a digital privacy task force was assigned to monitor and remove unauthorized content. Psychologists warned that this level of attention, especially in cases involving children, could inflict long-term psychological damage. The public's need for answers, closure, or entertainment often came at the expense of empathy. Hannah had become a character in a story rather than a child recovering from unspeakable trauma. Every theory built around her added another layer to that trauma, even if unintentionally. For the town of Ashwood, the media frenzy brought a different kind of grief. Residents who had lived their lives in quiet obscurity found themselves followed by reporters, bloggers, and amateur detectives. The local diner became a hotspot for eavesdropping. Private citizens were questioned about their neighbors. People began locking their phones and avoiding conversations with strangers. Ashwood became less of a town and more of a stage. The family's history was picked apart. Old yearbook photos, job records, church attendance, and minor financial disputes were reported on as though they held hidden meaning. Some reporters camped near the site of the murders, hoping to catch new footage. Others bribed former neighbors or classmates of the parents, seeking quotes or stories to sensationalize. Local officials condemned the tactics publicly, but admitted privately that there was no way to stop it. At the height of the coverage, the case became a cultural phenomenon. Late-night talk shows referenced it. A best-selling crime author announced a fictional novel inspired by the events. An independent filmmaker acquired rights from a distant cousin to produce a dramatized series, prompting public outrage and eventual cancellation after a petition drew over 200,000 signatures. Eventually, the intensity waned, but the internet never forgets. Theories persisted, reposted, and revised by new audiences every few months. Any minor update from law enforcement or the judiciary reignited interest. Whenever a similar crime occurred elsewhere, the Myers case would resurface in hashtags and timelines. For some, it remained a cold case. For others, it became something almost mythological. Years later, the phrase, "she is a chosen one," continued to echo online. It had become more than a clue. It was a symbol of unresolved horror, of innocence shadowed by darkness, and of a public desperate to find meaning in a senseless act. While the killer remained unidentified, their message had achieved something terrifyingly enduring. It had ensured the crime would never be forgotten, And for the one who survived it, that legacy was inescapable. In the absence of physical evidence and with public pressure mounting, law enforcement was forced to cast an increasingly wide net. Tip lines flooded with calls, and investigative teams began sifting through every possible thread, no matter how unlikely. What followed was a series of promising leads, each compelling, each examined thoroughly, and each ending in disappointment. The first serious lead came from a truck driver who claimed to have seen a man walking along the highway just outside Ashwood in the early hours of the morning the murders occurred. According to his statement, the figure was tall, wearing a hooded jacket, and carrying what appeared to be a duffel bag. While the sighting was within a few miles of the Myers residence and within the estimated post-crime timeline, no nearby businesses or traffic cams captured the individual. No discarded bag was ever found, and the description was too vague to act upon. DNA swabs from roadside litter returned no relevant matches. Next came a more tantalizing clue: a former handyman who had worked on the Myers property 6 months before the murders. He had done basic electrical work and had been inside the home multiple times. He was single, lived alone, and had a minor criminal record for breaking and entering. An anonymous tip alleged he had become fixated on Melissa Myers. Detectives brought him in for questioning. His alibi was thin. He claimed to have been home asleep, but his phone data placed him in another town the night of the murders. He willingly provided fingerprints and a DNA sample. Neither matched anything found at the crime scene. His prior behavior, while suspicious, did not link him directly to the murders. He was eventually cleared, though unofficial suspicion lingered. A third lead emerged when an inmate at a correctional facility claimed another prisoner had confessed to the killings during a shared psychiatric session. According to the inmate, the alleged confessor described the house in detail and mentioned a note about the chosen one. Investigators interviewed the accused, a mentally unstable man with a history of delusions. Under questioning, he changed his story repeatedly, first admitting guilt, then denying it, then claiming supernatural forces were involved. He had no connection to the family, no knowledge of Ashwood, and was incarcerated at the time of the murders. The confession was deemed fabricated, possibly motivated by a desire for attention or temporary transfer to a different facility. An online tip pointed investigators toward a recently fired high school teacher from a nearby town who had once taught Josh Myers in a summer enrichment program. The teacher, described by students as reclusive and intense, had allegedly made disturbing comments in class about cleansing society and elevating the worthy. A warrant was obtained, and his home was searched. While several journals containing philosophical and religious musings were discovered, none referenced the Myers family, Hannah, or any phrases resembling the chosen one. His online history showed no interest in the family, true crime forums, or local events. His termination had been over a non-criminal administrative issue. He was ruled out after thorough background vetting. Perhaps the most damaging dead end came when an investigative journalist released a podcast alleging that John Myers had been involved in a secret gambling ring and owed large debts to dangerous individuals. The podcast gained traction, prompting a full-scale inquiry into John's financial records. Bank statements, tax filings, and private correspondence were reviewed. No gambling activity was discovered. In fact, John's financial habits were consistent, conservative, and clean. The claim was later traced to a fabricated source. The journalist issued a retraction, but the damage had been done. Public opinion was influenced, and investigators had spent critical time chasing a fabrication. Several leads came from psychics and self-proclaimed mediums. One insisted the killer was an entity that existed in shadows. Another claimed Hannah had been marked by ancient forces and would be taken again on her 13th birthday. Law enforcement did not formally investigate these leads, but did keep records of them, primarily due to the volume of similar messages received. More than 30 individuals nationwide claimed to have had visions related to the case. Another false lead developed from a forensic software company that analyzed ambient noise in 911 calls made by neighbors on the morning of the discovery. The company claimed to detect a faint whisper in the background of one call, potentially saying the word he. The audio was enhanced, slowed, and reviewed by forensic audio experts. They concluded that the sound was most likely static interference combined with nearby cough, not human speech. The software's results were deemed inconclusive and unreliable. The FBI's Cybercrimes Division also investigated possible links to online radical communities. Some threads on fringe message boards discussed purification rituals and included cryptic language about the Chosen. However, none referenced Ashwood or the Myers. IP addresses traced back to users in different countries. No coherent manifesto or plan could be tied to any known group. The language in the killer's note appeared deliberately unique, not lifted from existing ideology or belief systems. The final significant lead involved a local man who, in the weeks after the murders, began attending community vigils and inserting himself into conversations about the case. He asked questions about Hannah, speculated publicly on the killer's motives, and even claimed to have felt something bad coming the night before the crime. A concerned citizen tipped off the police. Surveillance was initiated. His home was searched, and his internet activity was logged. Nothing illegal was found. He appeared to be a socially awkward man with a fixation on true crime, but he had no connection to the victims and no means or history of violence. As each lead collapsed, investigators were left with growing frustration. Every trail led to a wall. Every promising clue turned out to be nothing more than coincidence, fabrication, or misdirection. While public perception often imagines that every crime has a breadcrumb trail waiting to be followed, the Myers case offered none, only silence, shadows, and static, and a single note that continued to defy explanation. As the investigation into the Myers murders entered its 6th month, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, was brought in to develop a refined psychological profile of the offender. Without physical evidence, the behavioral footprint became the only map available. The nature of the killings, their precision, their silence, and a handwritten note suggested a deeply structured mind operating under an internal logic not easily deciphered. The profiler's task was to reverse engineer that logic. At the heart of any behavioral profile are 2 key elements: modus operandi, MO, and signature. The MO refers to the techniques used to commit the crime and escape undetected. The signature is what goes beyond necessity, the aspects that fulfill a psychological need. In the Myers case, the MO was clear: silent entry, surgical execution, minimal trace. But the signature lay in what the killer chose to leave behind. The phrase, "she is a chosen one," written in careful, center handwriting, was not necessary to complete the murders. It served no practical function. Its purpose was communicative, symbolic, and likely personal. This act of leaving a message, not to taunt, but to convey meaning, aligned with a particular offender type: the mission-oriented or visionary offender, someone who believes their act serves a greater goal, even if that goal is rooted in delusion. The wording of the note indicated premeditation. The killer had not acted on impulse. The phrase was brief but heavily loaded. Use of the third person, she, distanced the killer from Hannah emotionally, possibly implying objectification or a form of psychological elevation. Chosen one carried implications of destiny, selection, or purity. The phrasing evoked spiritual or ideological undertones, though no known religious or cult affiliations directly matched the language or the crime. The handwriting itself was evaluated by forensic document analysts. It displayed control, symmetry, and uniformity. The pressure was consistent. Letters were evenly spaced and not rushed. This suggested that the note had either been written at the scene by someone emotionally calm or had been written in advance and carefully placed. No indentation was found beneath the note on the wood surface of the nightstand, meaning no additional sheets had been used below it, a further indication of intent and deliberateness. The profiler's preliminary assessment proposed a high-functioning individual, likely male, aged between 30 and 45, with above-average intelligence and an ability to mimic normalcy. The killer would possess deep-seated beliefs, possibly delusional, about fate, purity, or divine selection. The planning and precision indicated an obsessive personality with possible narcissistic traits. The act of leaving a child alive, unharmed, and declared chosen reflected not empathy, but idealization. Hannah, in this framework, was not spared out of mercy, but preserved for a perceived higher purpose. Unlike thrill-motivated offenders, this killer showed no evidence of sadism, overkill, or personal rage. The murders were clean, efficient, and unemotional. This differentiated the case from domestic homicides or crimes of passion. The absence of any sexual component further narrowed the typology. There was no indication of physical contact violation or humiliation. The killer did not interact with the victims beyond the act itself. This detachment suggested not emotional shutdown, but moral framework in which the killings were justified, even necessary. Investigators explored whether similar cases existed in national or international databases. While no direct matches were found, analysts reviewed cases involving mission-driven killers, including those with religious delusions, lone wolf ideologies, and child-focused pathologies. In a few historic instances, offenders left similar thematic messages referring to divine purpose or transformation, but none had the clinical, nearly sterile execution seen in the Myers case. The lack of an apparent trigger also complicated profiling. Most killers have a catalyst: job loss, rejection, betrayal, illness, or ideological tipping point. The Myers family appeared random. No enemies, no controversies, no pattern of behavior that would link them to radical belief systems or illicit activity. The profiler proposed that the randomness itself might be part of the offender's worldview, the belief that fate selects, not reason. In this framework, the family was not targeted because of who they were, but because they fit a symbolic narrative known only to the killer. Another anomaly was the killer's silence post-crime. No follow-up letters, no online declarations, no contact with authorities. Most mission killers, once they begin, continue until captured or killed. They want their message known. The absence of repetition led to two possible interpretations. Either this was the beginning of something greater that had been paused or abandoned, or it was a standalone act, complete in the killer's mind. In both scenarios, the profiler warned of long-term risk. If the killer viewed the act as a complete ritual, he may disappear into anonymity, watching, waiting, or satisfied. If the act was preparatory, the child could remain in danger for years. Behavioral studies of ritualistic offenders show that significant gaps between acts are not uncommon, especially when the offender believes they are fulfilling stages in a larger plan. The killer's ability to neutralize an entire household without resistance also implied reconnaissance, patience, and possibly rehearsals. That level of planning pointed towards someone with previous experience in structured, high-risk environments, military, medical, or clandestine roles. However, no personnel records flagged individuals with relevant backgrounds and suspicious behavior. The behavioral analysis concluded that this was not a spontaneous crime, not driven by opportunity, nor reactive. It was, from beginning to end, a narrative enacted by someone living inside a complex belief system. The absence of chaos, the precision of action, and the symbolic preservation of the child all pointed to an offender who believed in the rightness of their actions. Whether that belief originated in trauma, isolation, ideology, or psychosis remained unknown. But as profilers emphasized in their final briefing, people who construct their own truth, when left unchecked, rarely stop at a single act. In this case, the killer had left no fingerprints, only intent. Following her relocation, Hannah Myers began a carefully monitored life under a new identity. Officially, her foster situation was described as temporary but stable, designed to shield her from media, curiosity seekers, and potential threats. Unofficially, every aspect of her existence was managed with the long-term psychological implications of her trauma in mind. But despite the best intentions of caregivers, psychologists, and law enforcement, the question persisted. Was Hannah truly healing, or slowly being reshaped by the aftermath? Children who endure extreme trauma, especially involving loss of family, intense media scrutiny, and unresolved danger, often face developmental shifts that are subtle and prolonged. While initial trauma responses are widely studied and understood, less is known about the long-term cognitive and emotional evolution of children whose survival becomes both symbolic and socially scrutinized. Hannah became one such case study. She resumed her education in a new district under a different name. The school administration was discreetly informed of her history, but teachers and classmates were not. To most of her peers, she was simply a quiet girl, slightly older than expected for her grade, with good academic performance and minimal social engagement. Initial reports from her educators noted that she was polite, withdrawn, and unusually observant. She did not speak of her past. She did not ask questions about others' families. She did not participate in group storytelling activities that involved personal life. One recurring observation across environments, school, therapy, foster home, was Hannah's tendency to absorb and mimic emotional responses. Rather than expressing raw emotions of her own, she often reflected those of others. If someone expressed joy, she smiled. If someone cried, she grew still, but her effect was muted, controlled in a way that felt beyond her years. Psychologists recognize this as adaptive behavior, common in trauma survivors who feel unsafe displaying true emotion. It was not yet pathological, but it was closely monitored. In therapy sessions, Hannah seldom initiated topics related to her family or the night of the murders. When gently encouraged, she deflected. Her drawings shifted over time from basic houses and landscapes to more abstract imagery. Trees with no roots, figures without faces, staircases leading into blackness. Art therapists debated whether these motifs were expressions of suppressed memory, metaphors for loss, or simply manifestations of an overactive imagination. No definitive conclusions were reached, but the themes were consistent. More concerning was Hannah's growing fixation on the phrase from the note, "the chosen one." While she never used the exact words unprompted, she frequently asked questions about destiny, specialness, and whether some people were meant to survive. She often framed these inquiries abstractly, posing hypothetical scenarios rather than directly referring to herself, but the pattern was clear. The phrase left behind by the killer had seeded a conceptual framework that was now shaping her identity. Trauma specialists feared this could evolve into a dangerous internal narrative. When children survive events framed in mythic or symbolic terms, they may internalize these themes as central to their sense of self. Without appropriate guidance, such beliefs can distort identity formation, leading to either grandiosity or deep alienation. Hannah's therapist responded with structured interventions, affirming her right to define her own life, emphasizing that survival was not a mission but a beginning, and encouraging creative expression free from narrative expectation. But even structured therapy has limits. Outside sessions, Hannah began asking adults around her whether they believed in fate. She inquired about religious concepts, ancient myths, and stories about children with special powers. She developed a strong interest in historical figures who had survived assassinations or accidents and who went on to become public figures or symbols. While these interests were not inherently alarming, the context of her history made them noteworthy. There was also a subtle but persistent belief among caregivers that Hannah was holding back information, not necessarily because she remembered more than she admitted, but because she had constructed a private understanding of what had happened, one she had no interest in sharing. She did not exhibit fear. She did not ask if the killer had been caught. She never expressed a desire for justice, nor did she ask why her family had been targeted. Her silence was not one of confusion, but of choice. Some experts hypothesized that Hannah had developed a protective belief system in which the event was no longer seen as an attack, but as a transition, one she was chosen to witness. In this frame, the trauma was not something that happened to her, but something she was meant to survive. While this allowed her to maintain emotional regulation, it risked reinforcing a distorted view of reality. Survivors often need grounding to differentiate between narrative and truth. Hannah, however, seemed more interested in constructing a private mythology. Meanwhile, her case remained open, and the FBI maintained passive oversight. Regular wellness checks and psychological evaluations continued. Security protocols remained discreet but firm. Surveillance of her online activity was authorized, largely to ensure that no external parties attempted contact or influence. So far, there had been no signs of stalking, messaging, or attempts to breach her anonymity. Yet the looming question remained. What if the killer had truly seen her as more than a witness? What if she had been the purpose, not the exception? For law enforcement, this uncertainty meant the case could never fully be closed. For psychologists, it meant that treatment could never rely on standard timelines. And for Hannah, it meant that the future, no matter how peaceful her surroundings, would always contain the shadow of that message. Whether she ultimately rejected or embraced the idea of being the chosen one, that phrase would forever be part of her psychological architecture, not because she believed it, but because someone had written it as if it were truth and left it behind like a prophecy waiting to unfold. One of the most perplexing elements of the Myers family case remained the home's modern security infrastructure and its complete failure to record, detect, or deter anything on the night of the murders. In an age where doorbell cameras capture package thieves and smart devices log every moment of household activity, the absence of digital surveillance data became a mystery of its own. The Myers house had been upgraded with what many would consider a standard suburban protection package, a combination of motion detectors, cameras, digital locks, and a central monitoring system connected to a mobile app. And yet, on the night of the murders, all of it recorded nothing useful. At the center of this problem was a house's security hub, a third-party device manufactured by a well-known home automation company. It had been professionally installed approximately 9 months prior to the incident. The system included 4 exterior motion-activated cameras, 2 interior sensors, one in the hallway, one in the kitchen, and a front doorbell camera with 2-way audio. All were connected to a cloud service that stored footage for up to 30 days. Initial examination confirmed the system was functional up until 12:58 a.m. on the night of the murders. At that exact time, all camera feeds went blank. The hub disconnected from a network, and no further data was recorded. When law enforcement later accessed the logs of the cloud account, they found an abrupt and total loss of signal. This alone was not impossible. Systems crash or disconnect, but the timing aligned too precisely with the estimated window of entry. Digital forensic experts were brought in to examine whether the system had been tampered with. The internal log of the hub device showed no signs of firmware manipulation, no brute force login attempts, and no external access from unknown IP addresses. The mobile app used by Melissa Myers had not been opened after 10:17 p.m. the previous evening. Her phone was found on the nightstand, undisturbed, with the app still logged in. It showed the same sudden offline alert at 12:58 a.m., but no action was taken. Investigators initially considered the possibility of a power outage. However, utility records for the street showed no interruptions during that period, and the home's smart thermostat, which operated on a separate internal network, continued logging temperature data throughout the night. This ruled out a total power loss. The focus shifted to possible local interference, jamming devices, Wi-Fi disruptions, or internal sabotage. Signal jamming, while technically illegal, is not beyond the capability of a skilled offender. A portable RF jammer can disable Wi-Fi, cellular, and Bluetooth frequencies within a limited radius. However, even powerful jammers typically leave trace electromagnetic signatures, and they do not explain internal shutdowns of hardwired components. Additionally, most consumer-level jammers have to be used in close proximity, within feet of the devices they affect. If such a device had been used, there should have been some lingering signature, unless the offender had activated it for just a brief window and removed it swiftly. One alternative theory was physical interference. The security hub, located inside a closet in the upstairs hallway, had no visible signs of tampering. It had not been unplugged. Its battery backup was intact. Post-crime testing confirmed that it responded normally to network connections and power cycling. Analysts concluded that whatever caused the disruption had not involved physical access to the device itself. The next avenue explored was a possibility that the system had been disabled via its known access points. The hub allowed control via the mobile app, the home's voice assistant, and a wall-mounted touchscreen panel. None of these had been used after 10 p.m. The touchscreen panel retained no fingerprints beyond those of family members. The voice assistant device, located in the kitchen, had no stored commands between midnight and morning. Its logs, stored on a separate server, were retrieved and analyzed. No voice command to disable security or silent alerts had been issued. The conclusion: either the system was disabled remotely by someone with highly specialized knowledge of the hardware and firmware, or the shutdown was triggered by a mechanism that left no digital footprint. Neither outcome provided reassurance. Investigators began looking into whether similar cases had occurred involving the same brand of security system. A limited number of complaints had been logged online regarding sudden system outages, but none were related to criminal cases or timed to suspicious activity. The manufacturer cooperated fully, confirming that no known vulnerabilities could explain what had happened without physical tampering or app-based access. Further technical forensics included packet analysis on the home's router, which had survived the event and continued functioning until it was removed as evidence. Log files showed no unusual data requests, pings, or DNS lookups during the relevant time frame. No rogue devices had connected to the Wi-Fi network. No malware was detected. For all practical purposes, the network was clean, and yet the security system went silent at the precise moment when it should have been most active. In parallel, law enforcement examined whether any nearby homes experienced unusual digital interference that night. Interviews and router log requests were submitted to neighbors. None reported outages or strange behavior in their home networks. A few security cameras captured uneventful footage of quiet streets and calm weather. No vehicles passed. No pedestrians were visible. The killer had avoided public view and bypassed private surveillance. Ultimately, the digital autopsy of the Myers home yielded one consensus among experts. The system had not failed. It had been neutralized, but the method remained undetectable. The crime scene was already strange in its silence, its surgical precision, and its lack of physical clues. Now, that silence extended into the digital realm. The house had been built to see, record, and alert, but it had seen nothing, recorded nothing, said nothing. In an age where everything leaves a trace, the Myers home had become an island of erasure, watched by devices designed to protect, rendered blind by hands no one could find. And in the void left behind, only one message remained. The surveillance saw nothing. The house told no story. But the silence itself, intentional, controlled, and absolute, became the loudest signal of all. As the Myers case deepened into one of the most enigmatic criminal investigations in recent memory, analysts began broadening their lens, looking beyond Ashwood to identify any potential patterns, similar crimes, or thematic overlaps that might offer context. When a case is marked by ritualistic overtones, inexplicable silence, and a distinct signature, the possibility arises that it is not entirely unique, but rather part of a wider, unrecognized pattern. The question became, had this happened before? The FBI's VICAP, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, database was searched extensively. It contained thousands of cases cataloged by method, motive, victimology, geographic region, and behavioral indicators. Analysts applied keywords from the Myers case. Phrases like ritualistic, note left, child spared, no forced entry, family murder, and chosen. While no case matched all of these terms perfectly, several shared notable elements that, when analyzed side by side, raised uncomfortable questions. The first comparable case emerged from 2003 in rural Idaho, where a family of four was murdered in their sleep. There was no forced entry, no theft, and no defensive wounds. A single child, a 5-year-old daughter, was found asleep in the house, untouched. In her bedroom, a message was found scrawled in black ink on the wall. Not yet. The case was never solved, and the phrase was dismissed at the time as the ramblings of an unstable intruder. But in light of the Myers case, investigators revisited it. The similarities were striking. Efficient killings, lack of evidence, and a single surviving child labeled, though cryptically, as exempt. A second case from 2011 in Nova Scotia featured a lone mother and her 2 children found dead in their home. There were no signs of struggle. A post-it note was discovered beside the youngest child, reading, "The innocent one sleeps." Again, no perpetrator was identified. Police initially suspected a failed burglary or murder-suicide, but autopsy reports ruled out self-inflicted wounds. The daughter, age 6, had been left unharmed. She remembered nothing. The case was quietly closed due to lack of leads. In 2017, a similar pattern emerged in Utah. A couple and their teenage son were found murdered in their cabin during a winter retreat. Their daughter, age 8, survived, claiming she had dreamed of angels and woke up to find everyone gone. No sign of forced entry, no defensive wounds. On the kitchen counter, a short phrase written on the back of a receipt, "One remains." The case remains unsolved. When these events were charted together by the BAU, a conceptual framework began to form. The common threads were not geographic proximity or victim relationships, but behaviorally distinctive patterns. Families killed efficiently, often at night. At least one child left unharmed. A cryptic message left behind, often referencing innocence, exemption, or purpose. No physical evidence or digital trace. Survivors with limited or no memory. No known motive, no sexual or financial element. Statisticians were quick to point out that coincidence cannot be ruled out in low-frequency, high-impact crimes. Family homicides do occur for various reasons: domestic violence, mental illness, financial stress. But these particular cases lack the usual triggers. There were no confessions, no suspects, and no plausible rational explanations. They were anomalies, not only in method, but in the psychological residue they left behind. The recurring element of a single spared child, often with no memory, prompted further speculation. Some analysts suggested a psychological component in the offender's mind, a desire not just to kill, but to send a message through survival. The idea of a witness, not to the crime itself, but the meaning behind it, reinforced the theory that these were not purely destructive acts. They were performances within a private ideology, possibly rehearsed or repeated over time. Criminologists considered whether a single offender could be responsible for all incidents. While the geographic spread argued against it, the time gaps, years between events, made it technically plausible. If the killer was mobile, disciplined, and operating under self-imposed rules, long cooling-off periods would be consistent with certain mission-driven or delusional offenders. An alternative theory proposed that these were not the acts of one person, but of multiple individuals shaped by a shared ideology. If an underground belief system, however fringe or decentralized, existed, it might manifest in similar crimes across different locations. The absence of manifesto, digital community, or recruiting platform made this hard to substantiate. But intelligence agencies have long noted that ideological contagion does not always require direct contact. Symbolic phrases, the chosen one, not yet, one remains, may function as coded affirmations within such a system. Others took a more esoteric view. Psychologists suggested that these phrases, while superficially meaningful, might stem from a delusional schema rooted in trauma, schizophrenia, or religious psychosis. A person suffering from such a condition might act out compulsions based on internal symbolism, targeting families arbitrarily, while believing they were following divine or cosmic instruction. If more than one such individual exists, or their actions are unknowingly reinforcing each other, then a pattern without a network is possible. The cases were shared across jurisdictions, and task forces informally agreed to cross-reference any future incidents that bore these hallmarks. A shared database was created for cases involving survivor messaging, and linguists were brought in to analyze phrasing patterns. Preliminary analysis suggested different handwriting styles, implying multiple offenders, but psychological convergence could not be ruled out. What had once seemed like a singular, horrifying act now took on a more ominous shape. The Myers case may not be alone. It may be part of a quiet, undetected sequence unfolding across years and borders, connected not by means or geography, but by belief. A belief not fully understood, not written down, not posted online. A belief that speaks only through silence, symbols, and the ones it chooses to leave behind. As the investigation into the Myers murders entered its second year, a deeper institutional analysis began to take shape. Not just of what had been done, but of what had been overlooked. In high-profile cases that remain unsolved despite extensive media coverage, technical expertise, and national resources, the failures often lie not in the effort expended, but in the assumptions made. The Myers case highlighted several critical blind spots across law enforcement, forensic, and psychological systems that may have unintentionally enabled the killer to disappear without a trace. The first and most glaring issue was the over-reliance on conventional profiling frameworks. While behavioral analysts accurately identified many characteristics of the likely perpetrator, calm, methodical, possibly delusional, there remained a strong bias toward known offender patterns. Investigators focused heavily on family acquaintances, disgruntled workers, ex-partners, and neighborhood threats. This was reasonable in most domestic homicide cases, where perpetrators are statistically close to the victims. But in the Myers case, the absence of emotional signatures, lack of interpersonal conflict, and surgical nature of the killing strongly indicated an outsider operating under an unusual motive. Despite this, the initial months of the investigation were consumed by background checks and character assessments of those within the family's social orbit, valuable time lost. Another major oversight involved technological complacency. The home's advanced security system failed at the critical moment, and investigators initially treated the failure as either a malfunction or coincidental outage. By the time deeper technical forensics were brought in, the potential for detecting short-term signal disruption or electromagnetic interference had passed. The forensic timeline failed to account for how rapidly transient data disappears from routers, smart devices, and server caches if not immediately preserved. In the digital age, the first 48 hours are no longer just about canvassing for eyewitnesses. They're also the only window in which volatile network artifacts might still be recoverable. Communication across agencies also revealed weak links. Although the FBI became involved early in the case, local law enforcement initially hesitated to share full access to all interview recordings and digital evidence. Concerns over jurisdictional control, media optics, and chain of custody protocols delayed collaborative analysis. Critical leads, such as an out-of-state tip referencing similar language used in an unrelated cold case, were not cross-referenced until months later. In cases with such an unusual profile, even minor delays in information sharing can allow rare offenders to vanish from view. Psychological services, while well-intentioned, operated within narrow clinical models that may not have been flexible enough to deal with the unusual cognitive imprint left on the survivor, Hannah. While trauma-informed care was applied appropriately, the deeper symbolic interpretations of her silence and behavior were not immediately explored. Therapists, adhering to ethical standards of non-suggestion, avoided pressing Hannah for meaning behind certain behaviors. But this caution may have inadvertently allowed emerging ideologies or self-mythologies to take root unchallenged. Her fixation on abstract themes, such as destiny, fate, and selection, should have prompted earlier consultations with forensic psychologists trained in cult behavior and indoctrination patterns, even in the absence of direct group involvement. Furthermore, forensic linguistic analysis was underutilized. The phrase, "she is a chosen one," while seemingly generic, contains syntactic and stylistic elements that could point to subcultural linguistic patterns. No early effort was made compared to online forums, religious manifestos, or delusional writings in psychiatric records. Only much later did computational linguists begin scouring dark web archives and anonymize patient writings for echoes of similar language structures. By that point, years of potential message board activity and ephemeral posts had disappeared into the digital ether. The academic community, too, remained largely sidelined. Sociologists, cult researchers, and comparative criminologists were not consulted until true crime media began drawing attention to pattern similarities. When they were brought in, they offered valuable frameworks for understanding symbolic violence, mythic framing of crimes, and identity-based selection. Some even posited that the act may not be a lone delusion, but part of a broader psychological phenomenon where rare individuals, disconnected from one another, manifest similar patterns of symbolic logic and behavior under specific psychological conditions, a theory rarely explored in conventional criminal justice. A less visible but equally important blind spot lay in how the media was handled. Early leaks to journalists created a feedback loop that distorted public perception and drowned out useful leads. While law enforcement attempted to control the narrative, public hunger for sensationalism led to the spread of misinformation, conspiracy theories, and false claims. This not only harmed the integrity of the case, but also contaminated witness recollections and discouraged individuals from coming forward, fearing ridicule or being misinterpreted. The system also failed to prepare for the possibility that this was not an isolated incident. Despite clear symbolic similarities with unsolved cases in other states and countries, there was no centralized tracking system for cases involving a specific signature. Family murder, child spared, note left. Only after independent researchers created unofficial databases did law enforcement begin to consider that the Myers murders may fit into a disturbing global pattern. Perhaps the most chilling institutional failure was not one of action, but of imagination. The idea that a person could infiltrate a secure home, kill with precision, leave a symbolic message, and disappear without motive or trace was so far outside the boundaries of ordinary criminal behavior that many investigators instinctively minimize its strangeness. But the details that make a case extraordinary are often the ones that reveal the truth. In this instance, The refusal to fully accept the surreal quality of the crime delayed the shift in investigative thinking that might have caught the perpetrator. By the time those blind spots were recognized, the trail had long since gone cold, and the child at the center of it all continued to grow up under the weight of a message written not just in ink, but in institutional silence, gaps, and the things no one thought to look for. Long after the crime scene was cleared and national media shifted its focus elsewhere, the town of Ashwood remained altered in ways both visible and intangible. The murders of the Myers family and the unanswered question of Hannah's survival left a wound that refused to heal, not just for the immediate community, but for all small-town Americans who had long trusted the boundaries of their peaceful, suburban lives. The case did not only break a family, it disrupted a myth that such things don't happen here. In the months following the murders, Ashwood experienced a rapid rise in personal security system purchases, firearm registrations, and home insurance upgrades. Local hardware stores reported unprecedented demand for door locks, motion lights, and surveillance kits. Entire neighborhoods began organizing private patrols. The sense of collective safety that had defined the town for decades dissolved into a culture of private vigilance and mutual suspicion. Porch lights were kept on all night. Windows stayed shut. Children who once played in open yards now remained inside behind locked doors. Local schools adopted revised emergency protocols. A new policy required background checks not just for faculty but for guest speakers, delivery personnel, and maintenance contractors. Morning check-ins became mandatory for all students, and an unspoken vigilance settled over classrooms. While no direct threats followed the incident, the psychological shadow was long. Teachers reported elevated anxiety among students, especially those close in age to Hannah. The notion that someone could enter a house undetected and commit such a crime deeply unnerved parents and children alike. Guidance counselors noted a significant increase in appointments related to nightmares, fears of abduction, and obsessive-compulsive behavior around security. Religious institutions played dual roles in the aftermath, offering comfort while also trying to interpret the chosen one message in the broader spiritual context. Sermons about divine protection, human evil, and moral accountability became more frequent. In some congregations, the phrase chosen was adopted as a motif for survival and resilience, while others condemned its use as a perversion of sacred language. One small denomination in Ashwood controversially held a series of cleansing rituals, interpreting the murders as a spiritual attack. Attendance initially surged, but community backlash soon followed, and the services were quietly discontinued. The media coverage itself became a source of trauma. News crews had saturated Ashwood during the early weeks, staking out the Myers home, interviewing neighbors, and airing speculative theories that often lacked foundation. Residents grew wary of outsiders, fearing misrepresentation or intrusion. Local officials issued public statements requesting privacy, and eventually enacted stricter press access rules during emergencies. Several families who lived near the Myers relocated within a year, citing stress, property value concerns, or the psychological toll of proximity to the crime scene. The Myers home stood vacant for months before being sold quietly under a new owner, who opted to demolish the structure and rebuild from scratch. That decision, while practical, had symbolic resonance. Some stains, even when invisible, are impossible to wash away. Local folklore quickly took hold, with children daring each other to approach the property line or claiming to hear whispers near the woods at night. What had been a nondescript suburban home became a landmark of unspeakable loss and unresolved fear. At the civic level, Ashwood's reputation transformed. Once marketed as a family-friendly town with low crime and excellent schools, its name became permanently tied to the phrase "the chosen one." Online searches of the town now brought up theories, timelines, and discussion threads. Outsiders began visiting out of morbid curiosity. True crime podcasters, amateur investigators, and paranormal enthusiasts passed through, some respectful, many not. Town leadership debated whether to rebrand certain public signage or community events to distance themselves from the crime, but local identity had already been shaped. Ashwood's experience rippled outward. Other small towns began preemptively upgrading security measures, especially in middle-class neighborhoods. State-level policy discussions emerged about how to support families affected by unresolved trauma, not just emotionally but economically. The idea of resilience funding was floated, grants for towns dealing with reputational damage due to high-profile crimes, but was ultimately shelved due to political deadlock. Still, the idea marked a shift in how communities conceptualize violence, not as isolated acts, but as long-term disruptions to local ecosystems. The case also influenced cultural expression. Independent filmmakers, horror writers, and artists began using themes from the Myers murders in metaphor or adaptation. One critically acclaimed short film featured a girl spared by a faceless killer who leaves behind only a single sentence carved into wood. A best-selling novel borrowed heavily from the narrative, though names and details were changed. These portrayals, while fictionalized, reignited debates about ethical storytelling, particularly when the real-life survivor was still a minor. In Ashwood itself, memory took multiple forms. A simple plaque was erected near the town library in quiet remembrance of the family, bearing only first names and dates. There was no mention of the crime. Some called it dignified. Others called it denial. What everyone agreed upon, however, was that something had changed. The murder of the Myers family was not simply a criminal event. It was a cultural fracture, a psychological intrusion that redefined what safety meant in modern America. Ashwood had become, unwillingly, a symbol, not just a tragedy, but the uneasy truth that there are forces which defy categorization, acts that don't fit our understanding of motive, justice, or evil. The case became a mirror in which every community saw the limits of their preparedness and fragility of the world they thought they knew. And somewhere beyond the reach of surveillance, arrest warrants, and public logic, the message still echoed. She is the chosen one. And no one knew why. As time progressed and public attention gradually moved on, the Myers family case settled into a status rarely discussed but deeply felt. A high-profile mystery with no resolution, no arrests, no suspects, no confirmed leads, no justice in the conventional sense. And yet, the case refused to fade. It lingered, not because of what had been discovered, but because of what had not. The absence of answers became the narrative itself, a vacuum that consumed theories, strained institutions, and reshaped lives. Criminal investigations are structured around resolution. Every file is open with the intent of closing it. There are forms, procedures, time frames, and expectations. But when a case resists conclusion, especially one involving such personal, ritualistic, and symbolic violence, those structures begin to unravel. Investigators retire. Leads expire. Evidence degrades. Public memory fractures. And what remains is something different from a traditional cold case. It becomes an ongoing disturbance in the psychological and cultural fabric. The open status of the Myers case carried legal, logistical, and ethical implications. From a judicial standpoint, it could not be declared officially inactive due to the presence of surviving victim, Hannah, and the persistent belief that the perpetrator or perpetrators might still pose a risk. As a result, the file remained under periodic federal review, subject to renewed analysis every 12 months. Advanced algorithms were applied to archived evidence. Voice recognition tools periodically reprocessed recorded tips. Geographic probability models were rerun with new data inputs. But each year, the conclusion was the same: no viable suspect. This ongoing ambiguity placed a unique burden on survivors. Not only Hannah, but extended family members, friends, and community members who continue to live under the shadow of a case unresolved. In closed cases, grief has boundaries. There's a verdict, a name, a sentence, however inadequate. That gives finality. In the Myers case, grief had no such closure. It was open-ended, recursive, and vulnerable to corrosive force of speculation. Psychologists who worked with trauma survivors in similar high-profile cases noted a common theme: the inability to trust the world again in the absence of cause. When there is no known motive, no identity for the killer, and no clear why, the mind has no place to rest. For Hannah, who had been spared without explanation, the future remained entangled with questions she could not answer. Was she chosen for survival? For witnessing? For something yet to happen? These questions were not merely philosophical. They influenced how she related to others, how she understood her self-worth, and how she viewed the fragility of life. For the broader public, the case took on the characteristics of myth. Like all enduring mysteries, it spawned narratives beyond what could be confirmed. Some saw it as evidence of a hidden cult or rogue intelligence operation. Others believed it to be the work of a serial killer whose ritualistic logic had gone undetected for decades. Still others framed it within supernatural or esoteric explanations. The lack of evidence invited the imagination, and in doing so, diluted the boundaries between fact and fiction. This transformation into folklore further complicated efforts by law enforcement to retain public credibility. The longer a case goes without resolution, the more the public replaces data with story, and the more difficult it becomes to separate useful leads from noise. The unresolved nature of the crime also raised questions about preparedness. In law enforcement training programs, the Myers case began to be cited not as a cautionary tale about negligence, but as an example of procedural limits. It demonstrated that even with modern surveillance, interagency cooperation, forensic science, and psychological profiling, there exist crimes that can bypass every safeguard. This forced a reckoning within the justice system, an acknowledgement that some crimes are not failures of detection, but reflections of an offender's complete understanding of how systems operate. Ethically, the persistence of the case complicated media coverage. True crime creators, documentarians, and investigative journalists continue to revisit the story, often under the banner of seeking truth or honoring the victims. But each new piece of content ran the risk of re-traumatizing those left behind or distorting facts in pursuit of narrative tension. The line between awareness and exploitation blurred. Consent from survivors and families became increasingly necessary, but also increasingly complex, as rights to public records conflicted with personal privacy. Despite all this, the unresolved status of the Myers murders served a function, one rarely acknowledged in official discourse. It reminded society that evil, in its purest form, is not always explainable. That harm can be inflicted without anger. That death can come not from chaos, but from cold clarity. In a world increasingly structured by surveillance, documentation, and digital traceability, the killer had moved through undetected, leaving only a note behind. And so, the case stands where so many end, not with a dramatic twist or satisfying conclusion, but with silence. There is no courtroom footage, no confession tape, no killer's name to be remembered or reviled, just the words written by an unknown hand, pointing not to a suspect, but to an idea. She is the chosen one. That idea, unchallenged and unresolved, became the story's endpoint, not a period, but an ellipsis, suspended over the life of a girl who survived in a town that didn't. And in the silence that followed, the real terror took root, not in what was done, but in what would never be understood. Thank you for listening. If this story kept you thinking, unsettled, or simply awake longer than you expected, you're not alone. There are truths we'll never fully uncover, and questions that echo louder in silence. If you'd like more true crime stories like this, the ones that stay with you long after the screen fades, don't forget to subscribe to MrDarXnight and turn on notifications so you never miss a whisper in the dark. Leave a comment below if you made it to the end. And if you're still awake, you might want to check out the next mystery waiting for you. Sleep well if you can.